Western theology and poverty. Have you ever asked yourself why there is Black, African, Latin American, womanist or liberation theology, but no such thing as white Western male theology? Why some theologians spiritualize and romanticize poverty? In today's podcast, we continue with our conversation with John Scheepers, where we tackled, amongst others, these questions. John loves Jesus and our nation. He is the founder of Isipambano Center for Biblical Justice. He has written a master's thesis titled A Critical Evaluation of the Conservative Evangelical Great Commission Paradigm of Mission as it Relates to Social Justice in the South African Context, which he passed cum laude at Stellenbosch University. If you are keen to listen to the full podcast and not just a summary on YouTube, you are most welcome to click on the link in the description. John reminds us that white supremacy was and still is in many ways alive in theological exposition. He touches on the myth that white supremacy is always intentional, is not common, and only evoked by extremists and domestic terrorists that are seen waving the apartheid flags at stadiums, and that it is only upheld by white people. He makes the point that just because someone identifies as a person of color doesn't prevent that person from propagating white supremacist views and ideologies, even when engaging with scripture. He asserts that white supremacy for hundreds of years has been and still is in the air we breathe and the water we swim in. The above, coupled with the false notion that many missionaries assume themselves to be pure vessels with no culture, funneling truths of scripture untainted by their culture, worldview, and context. This made white Western culture and context and influences seep in through the back door without being challenged. Despite more than 2 decades of democracy and official efforts to rethink racial politics, whiteness in South Africa continues to exude a sense of normativity. More on this later. Hello and welcome to Context. My name is Themba Dlamini. Thank you so much for tuning in. If this is your first time here, thank you for taking the time out to join us. If you enjoy this video, consider subscribing. Hit that little bell notification so you won't miss out on Context. John points out that there are tons of white Western male theology. Yet it's not called that, but referred to as orthodoxy or pure theology, which of course, if you've been listening to our podcast, you would know that there is no such thing as pure theology. White theology in South Africa and other parts of the wider church around the world has been given a sense of normativity. In other words, it was considered standard church theology that all other theology was to be measured and weighed against. And it is through this idolizing of white supremacy that theology formed in the context of white supremacy, patriarchy, and wealth and privilege entered through the back door. The efforts of this theology are evident in many parts of scriptural interpretation, but none is more pronounced than in the romanticization and spiritualization of poverty. This is the very theology that makes us numb to the poverty, landlessness, inequality, and the suffering that is all around us. When the Bible speaks of hunger, we've reinscribed it to mean spiritual hunger. This is easy to get wrong if the person doing the theological interpretation has themselves not experienced hunger except by choice. They are predisposed to only see spiritual hunger when the Bible is clearly also referring to physical hunger. Although, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the interpretation is limited to a physical interpretation only. Stats SA says over 55.5% of South Africans live below the poverty line. These are people who are unable to satisfy their basic needs such as food, water, or their social needs for security such as a place to live that keeps them warm, dry, and safe. Access to nutrition that helps them not only survive but thrive spiritually, physically, and mentally. Yet many have used the Bible, or should I rather say silent scriptures that speak directly to these issues, with the consequence of either romanticizing or spiritualizing poverty and hunger. Examples of spiritualization and romanticization of poverty can be seen in the work of theologians like Kenneth Bailey, who takes the parable in Luke 16 verses 19 to 31 of the rich man and Lazarus. Lazarus and the rich man is a well-known parable. Jesus shares the story of a notably wealthy man who lived a life of extravagant luxury. Laying outside the entrance of this rich man's house, though, was an exceptionally unfortunate man called Lazarus, who only hoped to eat what fell from the rich man's table. The rich man was very unsympathetic to the dilemma of Lazarus, offering him no love, help, or compassion. In time, they both met their mortal ends and passed on to the afterlife. Lazarus was welcomed into heaven while the rich man was condemned to hell. Pleading to Father Abraham in heaven, the rich man asked that Lazarus come from heaven to cool his tongue with a drop of water to reduce his agony in this fire. The rich man additionally requested Abraham to send Lazarus back to earth as a warning to his brothers to atone for their sins. However, both requests were refused. Abraham told the rich man that if his brothers did not believe in Scripture, neither would they believe Lazarus, even if he came directly from heaven. The parable's message is clear. The rich man is condemned for being rich, and the poor man is exalted because he is starving. However, Bailey argues that the parable is about Lazarus' righteousness, comparing him to St. Francis of Assisi. He writes, "In this parable, with the briefest of strokes, Jesus paints a clear picture of Lazarus' gentle soul." Bailey further writes, "Lazarus is quiet. The gentle, long-suffering man has no reservoir of anger, no score to settle, and no vengeance to exact." Note in the passage, there is no such depiction of Lazarus being a gentle soul who is a model of one who shows mercy to his enemies. However, there is nothing in this parable that depicts Lazarus as being a model of mercy. In short, Lazarus is a sick and a poor man to whom God shows a preference, while the rich man is condemned. Of course, there is more to this parable, but trust you get the picture of theology refusing to see the obvious, but rather inscribing spirituality and ignoring the rich versus poor dynamic in the parable. Mark Breeding argues in his book, Jesus, the Revolution of the Poor, that this exposition by Kenneth Bailey is a superb example of both romanticizing and spiritualizing the hunger, sickness, and poverty of a man. Faithful disciples of Christ will not ignore the suffering of the poor like the rich man in this parable did. Jesus told us that when we show mercy to the poor and help our neighbors in need, we are actually ministering to the Lord himself. "Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Matthew 25 verses 40. Christians are known by the righteous fruit they yield, not the worldly acquiring of wealth. If we are rich, we are to use that wealth for the glory of God and the love of our neighbor. It is worth noting that some of these so-called heroes of faith or revered theologians did not care much for the oppressed. In fact, some like Jonathan Edwards not only did not see anything wrong with slavery, but themselves owned slaves. No wonder we've invented theology and ways to help us sleep at night whilst turning a blind eye to the poor and oppressed of our country. We need to clean our lenses and start seeing poverty and inequality for what it is. It is an assault against God. Why is the story of Lazarus important to Christians today? This parable is both a jab at the rich, uncaring, and hope for the oppressed. The meaning of the rich man and Lazarus is a warning to those that aren't paying any attention to the needs of others. That attitude has no place in God's kingdom. While it is a jab for some, there is hope in this story for many as well. Many listening were the oppressed, the poor, the sick, those taken advantage of. For them, this story is one of hope that one day their pain will end and they will find the life they truly desire with God. This parable is designed to force us, the readers, to reflect on how we treat Lazarus-like people. The rich man remains nameless so that we can place ourselves in his shoes. Let's be honest with ourselves. We probably see a little of him in our own lives, don't we? We are also just like the rich man, more than we care to admit. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. What are your thoughts on poverty and South African theology? Are you upset that the church is silent on poverty and landlessness and inequality? Let's talk about it. Leave a comment in the comments section below. Next week, we head down to Cape Town, the mother city, and speak to author and poet Thandi Gametse and veteran of the anti-apartheid movement and co-director of the Justice Conference South Africa, Renee August, two of the most exceptional women in our nation. Here's a sneak peek of next week.
My people, called, known, created, freed, redeemed, liberated my people. How quickly you have forgotten our shared history, how swiftly you have reduced me to a god of apathy, neutral in the face of injustice. Do you not know me at all?
Remember to like, subscribe, and share with whomever you think will benefit from the content. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Salani Gahle. Until next time, cheers. Bye-bye.